All right, now that we have our HUD and our ship moving and doing everything we'd like, let's actually add a background to our game. So what we're going to do is create a new class, and we're going to add a new empty file. I'm going to say that this is an empty class, and I'm going to call this background. Okay, so we have this empty class. Into the ship class, I'm actually going to take the top using information out of the ship class and copy that into the top of our background class. And I'm going to maintain a private sprite. I'm going to call it stars. And then in the constructor, I'm going to do what we've done before in loading a texture. So we've got a texture 2D. I'm going to call it T is equal to a new texture 2D. And we're going to pull in from the application assets folder. We'll call this stars background.png. And it's not a bitmap, so we'll set that to be false. And so we need to actually bring that in. So into our assets folder, we're going to use the stars background. Okay, so we've actually got this into my assets folder. Right now all we have is the player ship PNG, and I want this stars background. Now I'm actually going to use Nebula on top of that later, so I'm going to go ahead and copy all of that up and add that into my project. So just take the stars background Nebula 01 and Nebula 02 and put that into the assets folder, and then back here in our project do a right click on assets and add files, and let's add the Nebula 1 and Nebula 2 and the stars background. So I've done a control click to highlight those three, and we'll add those in. So now if you look at the properties of those, the build action is content for the Nebula, Nebula 2, player ship, and stars background. So that's going to be compiled in and copied to the actual application folder when we run this. Okay, so we've got our texture, and then I'm going to create my stars back in the background constructor. Stars is equal to a new sprite, and I'm going to pass it the graphics. And I'm going to pass it that texture. So I'm adding this stars sprite to the graphics context. And like before, we're going to need to take in the graphics context into our constructor background. We're going to need to maintain a private graphics context. This is just like we did with the ship, the player ship. And the first line of code here in the constructor is going to be that graphics is equal to the graphics context that's passed into us. Okay, so now we're really kind of doing the same thing that we've done before. We create this new sprite. I'm going to set the stars.position x to be 0 and the stars position y to be 0. So I'm placing this star field background in the upper left, and it's of the size, if you look at this, the stars background is going to be a 960 by 544 graphic, which is exactly the size of the Vita display or the simulator display that we've got here. So I'm going to set its position to be 0, 0, and then I'm going to create a render function, public void render. I want to actually have this thing displayed. And what we're going to do then is just tell the stars to render themselves. So this should look very, very familiar to you, because if you look at the ship code, right, the render for the ship code just told that sprite to render itself. And here we're going to tell the stars background to render when we want it to display the stars field. Okay, so now that I have this background class, let's create one of these back in main. Let's create a private static background, and I will call it lowercase b background. In my initialize, we'll set the background to be equal to a new background, and we'll pass it the graphics context that we're in. And when we render our game, in addition to rendering the ship and the HUD, the first thing we want to do is render the background. So I'll call the render function of our background before I display the ship, otherwise the ship will be actually behind the stars. And let's run this now. And we get this lovely starfield background, right? Our HUD is still working and our ship is still moving, but we've got this great background. So it's a bit better than that black solid background that we had. And now let's actually make this to where it moves. That'd be a nice addition to make it seem like the ship is flying. In order to do that, we're just going to need to modify the background class. Let's create a public void update method, right? And it'll actually be pretty easy to get this thing to move. I'm just going to set the star's position in the X to be one less than it was before. Okay, so let's run this. Well, before we do that, we actually need to call the update method. So in addition to updating the ship and the HUD, I'm going to set my background to be updated as well. And now let's run, and we'll see the starfield moving, right? So it's moving rather slowly, and you see a problem here in that graphic is moving off the screen, and because of that it's leaving kind of this dead space over here. So we need to fix that, and the easiest way to fix that is to actually display two of these star fields adjacent to each other, one starting at 0, 0, and then one starting at the width 0. So it's all the way over to the right, and then we'll move both of them, and it'll look like both of them are, you know, we'll always see a piece of both of them, but it will look like it's one continuous star field. So the easiest thing to do is to create a separate sprite called stars2, and then we only need one copy of the texture, but I'm going to copy this stars new sprite, and I'll say stars2, 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 right? Because it's using the second copy of this is still using the same graphic and texture. The difference here is I'm going to set the position, the start position of the stars2, which is the second copy of this, to be the width of the graphic. So it's going to actually have two of these next to each other, but the second one is going to be offset by just as far to the right as the width of the original. And then what we'll do is we'll update the position of both of these, stars position, stars2 position, x minus minus, and I'm going to render stars and stars2. Now what's really nice is since I put this in a background, I don't need to update my app main, because as far as the app main is concerned, I have a single background, and what makes up that background is really not up to the main game itself. It just needs to update itself, and it needs to draw itself, and then here in the background I've actually added that second copy. So let's see what this looks like now when we run this. And this looks a lot better, right? So the star field is moving, and it's moving rather slowly, but you can see there's actually a small seam right here, and you can see it's moving. We've got both of the stars and stars2 that are being displayed, but now since we're seeing pieces of both of them, we don't have a real problem, and we've got a nice background there. But if we give it another minute or so, what you'll see is this gap is coming in here again, and that's because I've rendered the first and the second, but now they're both kind of moving too far off the screen. So I'd like to fix that by actually putting in some logic in the update to say, hey, has this thing moved too far back? And if so, I want to move it back and reset its position. So let's go into the background class, and here in the update function, I'm going to see if the star's position in the X is less than negative stars dot width. And if that's true, then I know that it's moved too far to the right, meaning if the first copy of this stars background graphic has moved so far to the left that you can't see any of it, meaning it's moved all the way off and its width so that there's none of it showing, then what I'd like to do is set the stars, right, stars dot position X back to 0, that's where we started it, and I'm going to set the stars2 position in the X to be equal to the star's width, right? And this is exactly where we started these, right? So we set the stars2 position X to be star's width here, and we set the stars position X to be 0. So I'm going to reset these. If they've moved so far off, I'm just going to push them back off to the right, and we won't see any jitter so long as we've created a nice smooth background there. Okay, so let's run this now. And if all is well, then we should just be able to watch this for a bit of time, and we'll see that there should be no gap and that the stars should look like they're going forever. And if you've got a nice background, then you shouldn't really see any repeat. But if you try to do this with your own, creating a new background, make sure that the far left and the far right kind of match up nicely, and there's not going to be a very visible gap there. Let's give this a little bit longer, and we should see that there's no problem and that the stars keep moving and keep showing up, and there's no kind of black gap that's going to come there. And that looks like it was going pretty well. So let's create a second texture within our background. What I'd like to do is kind of repeat what we've done here with the sprite for the stars, but I'm going to call this Nebula and Nebula 2. And I'm going to go ahead and create two of them because we know that we're going to have to draw two of them, right? And then here, after I have loaded the stars background, I'm going to load the nebula background. So I don't need to redeclare T as a texture 2D. I've already got that variable. So I'm just going to say that T is equal to a new texture 2D, and I'm going to point it to application assets, and this time it's going to look for that nebula01.png file, right, which is one of those assets that we pulled in right here. And then I'm going to create a nebula to be a new sprite. I'm going to pass it my graphics that I have, and I'm going to pass it this new texture that I just loaded. I'm going to set its position in the X to be 0 and its position in the Y to be 0. So I'm starting it in the upper left as well. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the Nebula 2. But like I did before, I'm going to set its X position to be the width of this nebula that I just created. So this is really identical to the stars background. I'm just loading in a new graphic. Okay, so now I've got my stars background and my nebula. I've got two copies of the stars and I've got two copies of this nebula. And I'm going to need to repeat this logic of the stars for the nebula. Okay, so I'll just set nebula.position X, and I'm going to do minus equal 2 instead of minus minus. So the nebula is going to be this kind of vaporous cloud looking stuff, and it's going to move twice as fast as the stars. What this will do is it will create a sense of depth, and we call this parallax scrolling. So the stuff that's closer to you as the player is going to be moving faster than the stuff that's a bit further away. These are still both in the background behind the ship, but they will be moving, the nebula will be moving twice as fast as the star field because I'm doing moving to the left by 2 there. Okay, and just as I checked to see if the star's position was too far back, I'm going to check the nebula position in the X and see if it's less than the width, meaning I can't see any of it. And if that's the case, I'm going to reset the nebula's position in the X to be 0. And I'll reset the Nebula 2's position in the X to be equal to the nebula's width. Just like I did with the star field, this is going to reset so that we never see that kind of black stuff that's going on there. The last thing I need to do is, in addition to painting my stars, I need to render my nebula sprites. So nebula.render and nebula2.render. And now that I have both of those, my background should be finished. I am loading in these graphics, 2 copies of the stars and 2 copies of the nebula, and I'm updating the position of both copies of the stars and both copies of the nebula, checking to make sure that they're not running off the edge of the screen and resetting them if they do. And then every time you tell me to render the background, I'm going to render both of the stars and both of the nebula. What's really cool again about this is that the app main doesn't have to change. It's just telling the background to render itself and the background to update itself. And then it's all up to the guts of the background class to handle that. So let's run this and see what we get. We've got a bit of an error, so let's fix this. This was a cut and paste error. You'll notice that I'm getting a warning here saying that the Nebula 2 is never assigned to, and that's because here when I did my cut and paste So nebula is a new sprite and nebula is a new sprite. I actually need to set this to nebula 2 is equal to a new sprite and position X and position Y. So this is actually an interesting error because what I've done is the problem, I did the cut and paste there and I just created 2 copies of nebula, but nebula 2 was actually never created. And the error that I got was that nebula 2 is null because I had never actually created a new sprite for that. So let's make that change and stop this, right? So that's a way of getting your debugging. Lesson of the day, we need to make sure that we've created it. So make sure you go and fix this and say nebula 2 is equal to a new sprite, nebula 2 position and the nebula 2 position of the Y. And now let's run this and we should be good. Okay, so here we go. We've got the stars moving and we've got the nebula, this kind of purple stuff in the top and the bottom moving. The ship is painted on the top because both of these appear in the background. What's really nice there is this is just going to continue on forever and it will never run out because we have got 2 copies of it and both of them are being kind of flopped and continually recycled as necessary. Okay, so you can let that run for a bit and prove to yourself that it's never going to run out, that just by using 2 copies of these sprites we get this really nice ongoing moving effect, and it looks even like some of the stars are twinkling as the nebula is painted on top of that. If you wonder how I'm getting some semi-transparency, if you look at the nebula graphic itself, then you should see I've got some alpha channel here to where I'm able to kind of look through and see some of that graphic. Okay? And now that we've got our background working, let's actually create a foreground. So what we'll do is we'll paint the background, then we'll paint the ship, and then we'll paint the foreground. And the easiest way to do this is to actually take your background, right-click on that, and click Copy, because we're going to change and copy the entire source file there. And then right-click on Start Shooter, and click Paste. And that gives us a background copy. Let's rename that by right-clicking on that and call it Foreground. And now we have a foreground and a background CS. The problem here is I need to rename, right? Let's rename this to foreground with a lowercase g. And now I'm going to change in the foreground class itself. I'm going to change the name of the class to foreground, and I'll need to change the name of the constructor to foreground. Now I don't need the stars background, so I'm going to get rid of that. And I don't need the stars, I just need the nebula. Instead of loading nebula 1, I'm going to load nebula 2. And that's going to be that second graphic that we brought in. Everything else is the same, except now I don't have stars position or stars 2 position, so I can delete that. And I don't need to render the stars or stars 2. I just have a single nebula. It's a different graphic though, so that's important here. And I'm going to move it by 3 instead of 2. So now we've got a foreground class that has 2 copies of this nebula, and it's using the nebula 02 PNG file. I continue to set up my graphics context and then create 2 instances and position them appropriately. And now I'm going to subtract 3. So this one's going to be moving faster than either the star field or that previous nebula that we had in the background. Okay, now the only thing I need to do is go into my main application and create an instance of the foreground. So let's create a private static foreground. Okay, so we have private static foreground, lowercase f foreground. In here, I'm going to create the foreground as a new foreground, passing it my graphics context. And in my update, I need to make sure that I update my foreground. And in render, I'm going to render my background, then render my ship, and then I'm going to render my foreground. Now I'm going to display the HUD last, so that's going to actually appear on the top of the foreground. And let's run this. And in my mad fury of copying and pasting, I deleted the texture declaration. So let's go back up here and copy this texture 2D. That's what we need to have here. So texture 2D T is equal to a new texture 2D. All right, so we just need to make sure that we declare that texture first before we use it. And now we can run this. And we get our background, which is our stars and that darker purple nebula, but we also get this lighter nebula on top. And if we fly the ship over to the top or to the bottom, you can see that the ship is behind that foreground nebula. The HUD is still on the top of it all, and we get a really nice parallax scrolling effect because each of these layers is rendering at a different speed. The stars are rendering by moving 1 every time. The background nebula is being moved by 2, and the foreground nebula is being moved by 3. The ship, of course, is being moved by 4, so it's going to move faster than any of that. And we get a really nice parallax scrolling effect here. Okay, so to review what we did, we brought in the nebula 1 and 2 and the stars background into our assets. We then created a background and a foreground class, and the background class consists of 2 copies of the star field and 2 copies of the nebula. We're going to set each of those up in the constructor for the background class, and then in the update we're going to move the stars and the second copy of the stars by 1. We're going to move the nebula by 2, and that second copy of the nebula by 2. We need to make sure that if they've gone too far to the left that we reset them, and then the render is simply just displaying both of those copies of sprite for the stars and the nebula. The foreground is nearly identical. We just have 1 copy of the nebula, and then nebula 2 is a second copy of that, using a different graphic file here. And then in the update, we're moving them both by 3, and then checking to see if they've gone too far to the left and resetting them appropriately. In our main application, we then create an instance of the background and an instance of the foreground. We then create new background and new foreground in the initialize, and then we update the background and foreground in the main games update. And in the render, we're going to render the background and then the ship, and then we'll render the foreground. And that'll do it for this tutorial.